Welcome back to Chapter 2 of KATR Classics Anne of Green Gables. This is Matthew Cuthbert is Surprised.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Matthew Cuthbert had never been a witness to a bank robbery or even so much as a chicken heist. He had read about them in the papers and the pulp paperback collection he kept secreted away in a bedroom closet. For a moment, however, Matthew imagined himself as the dashing getaway driver for a band of virtuous thieves, his black cloak streaming behind him as he whipped his sorrel mare. Matthew dreamed of this, of course, to offset the anxiety he felt whenever he had to pass Mrs. Rachel Lynde.
Matthew had driven past Mrs. Rachel every time he'd come or gone from Green Gables since he learned to drive the mule team at the age of 8. This day of all days was different. Matthew flew by Rachel Lynde's watchful glare, whipping his poor little mare like he was attempting to outrun the devil himself.
Not a look!
Rachel exclaimed from inside Matthew Cuthbert's considerable imagination.
Not a nod!
He thought to himself. He was able to recreate the scene from the Lynde veranda with shocking accuracy.
Matthew was normally preoccupied with worry about his momentary interaction with Rachel Lynde, but today his mind was honestly far from Green Gables. For today was the day that he was to drive to Bright River to pick up the orphan boy. His orphan boy. It was the his part of the equation that Matthew could not quite decipher. It was also the they part of things that had him ultimately flummoxed. He and his sister Marilla had lived alone in Green Gables since the passing of their mother 38 years ago. He had dutifully taken care of the property, and it was the envy of Prince Edward Island.
Matthew was making some difficult realizations that summer. He had given thought again to hiring one of the young French boys, but couldn't fondly reckon of the idea of anyone but a native-born Canadian running Green Gables.
There you go again, Matthew.
He chuckled to himself.
Giving way to these new great ideas. As if a land-holding Frenchman, Irishmen, or black would ever take up residence in Prince Edward Island.
Matthew huffed at himself. Like most people who keep to themselves, he was prone to these little internal arguments.
The Cuthberts had hired a young French boy to tend the fields and stables the year prior, and the scandal had hardly stopped wagging on the tongues of the Avonlea busybodies. Matthew wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of the past and would be happy if he'd never heard the word cucumber again. So he'd set his mind on adopting a boy of 11 or 12, old enough to do the chores, but young enough to be brought up properly.
Matthew Cuthbert was taking his time after striding past Rachel Lynde without a nod, a crime on par with plundering a cucumber patch. Matthew had brought his pace to a near standstill, and he was making sure to nod at everyone he passed along the avenue. He was making his way to the train station at the town called Bright River. Matthew didn't know anyone from Bright River, so he was more prone to smile and even converse with people he didn't know, and more importantly, didn't know him.
How do, Angus?
Matthew called to the one person he did know in Bright River. Angus Iverson was Matthew's Bright River doppelganger, awkward, gangly, with that same stream of white hair cascading from his engineer's cap. They both made similar gazes towards the heavens, and then in their anxiety begun what most polite company would not call a conversation.
Hey, who there, Matthew?
Train been here?
Oh, yeah, it's about an hour ago.
Oh?
Yet, and I see they only brought a half load of white flour. Seems the Pringles are feeling the pinch from the wheat blight and all.
Oh?
Why, yes, Matthew, that's right, and I don't know about you, but I don't give a tinker's damn about the trouble in Halifax, and certainly not the tribulations of the Pringle family.
Who?
Why, that clan, the Pringles, they are the antithesis to everything right and true, Matthew.
I hear they're descendants of the Bavarian Holsteins.
It's a boy I've come for.
Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew, did I mishear you? Did you just say you joined a cabal to plot and kill the Pringle family?
On the 12:30 train, a boy came by way of Mrs. Spencer from Halifax.
A Pringle boy?
No. Matthew Cuthbert had grown weary of the conversation and had decided that Angus was not such a kindred spirit after all.
That girl? That thing? Buck-toothed and ugly as sin.
Angus said over his ugly buck teeth. Oh, quiet, Angus,
Matthew said, sure he was just there to get a boy. It was then that Angus made an angry lunge for Matthew and shoved him against the fence post. Matthew's eyes bulged as he saw the man not try to punch him, but kiss him.
Holy shit.
Matthew cursed and shoved Angus back, but to no avail. Angus would get his kiss.
What Matthew didn't notice was the pair of eyes bulging to match his own from the end of the platform of the rail depot. And Shirley's first impression of Matthew Cuthbert was of him bloodying the jaw of a senile old homosexual. I ain't like that, Angus,
Matthew grumbled, fixing his coat and dusting off his cap.
Oh, dear and merciful Lord, I'll burn in hell, won't I, Matthew?
Angus began to weep.
Matthew thinks nothing of the scamp of a girl bystanding to this awkward encounter.
I'm here to pick up the orphan boy,
Orphan boy?
toots Angus with a newfound glint in his eye.
Yeah, I like the way you think, Cuthbert. Let's go find that orphan boy.
Oh, no, Angus. You'd better go get yourself right with God. Or at least Mrs. Iverson.
Matthew blundered as he pushed Angus aside and made his way to the platform.
As Matthew walked, he felt a hand grab the left cheek of his buttocks.
Oh, but not just yet.
He found it annoying, but not altogether unpleasant. Matthew whirled and roundhouse kicked Angus Iverson squarely in the jaw. The kick was not without intimacy, but closed the door on any further interactions with Angus.
Matthew composed himself and pretended not to look at the waif of a girl whose eyes shone as bright as the red locks upon her head in the midday sun. He looked everywhere but directly at the girl. He was there to retrieve a boy, yet no boy presented himself, well, other than Angus, who was passed out ass over tea kettle.
Are you Mr. Matthew Cuthbert?
Anne asked, having seen this man answer to the name Matthew for the past 5 minutes.
Why, no.
Matthew said, not being too quick on his feet when engaged in conversation outside his imagination.
Why, I'm Angus Iverson.
Matthew points to the man crumpled on the ground.
That's Matthew Cuthbert.
Matthew then made a hasty retreat to the sorrel mare and buggy.
You are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert. I've been told to sit here by Mrs. Spencer until you arrived, and sit here I shall.
Anne said with a smile, loading her own carpet bag into the buggy and snuggling right up next to Mr. Matthew Cuthbert.
I decided that had you not come for me, I was going to sleep in that wild cherry tree.
Anne beamed.
Can you imagine how romantic it would be to sleep in a cherry tree in the moonlight?
Matthew could imagine it, but he could never admit it. He'd also decided that no matter what the mistake had been, this was the orphan that had been dispatched to the Cuthberts at Green Gables.
No, sorry I was late. Oh, I am glad you have come, even though it would have been nice to sleep in a wild cherry tree.
Anne smiled, but Matthew had no response.
Is it a long way to where we're going? It's about 8 miles.
Matthew responded dryly.
Mrs. Spencer said it was 8 miles. I'm glad because I love driving. Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody. Not really. But the asylum was the worst. I've only been in it for 4 months, but that was enough. I don't suppose you were ever an orphan at an asylum, so you can't possibly understand what it's like. It's worse than anything you could imagine. Mrs. Spencer said it was wicked of me to talk like that, but I didn't mean to be wicked. It's so easy to be wicked without knowing, isn't it?
A gnawing worry began on Matthew's heart, and it fluttered as he thought of something to respond with.
I don't know. I used to lie awake at nights and imagine things like that because I didn't have any time in the day. I guess that's why I'm so thin. I am dreadful thin, aren't I? There isn't a pick on my bones. I do love to imagine I'm nice and plump with dimples in my elbows.
As they left the village, they swept past a grove of blooming cherry trees, and Anne reached her hand out of the buggy and snapped a branch off and showed it to Matthew.
What does this remind you of?
Matthew chuckled to himself and said, "What is it with this kid and cherry trees?"
I don't know.
He responded.
Why, a bride, of course. A bride all in white with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what she would look like. I don't ever expect to be a bride myself. I'm so homely, nobody will ever want to marry me. Unless it might be a foreign missionary. I suppose a foreign missionary mightn't be very particular, but I do hope that someday I shall have a white dress. That is my highest ideal of earthly bliss. I just love pretty clothes, and I've never had a pretty dress in my life that I can remember, but of course it's all the more to look forward to, isn't it? And then I can imagine that I'm dressed gorgeously. This morning when I left the asylum, I felt so ashamed because I had to wear this horrid old wincey dress. All the orphans had to wear them, you know. A merchant in Hopeton last winter donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Some people said it was because he couldn't sell it, but I'd rather believe that it was out of the kindness of his heart. Wouldn't you?
Matthew didn't quite know what wincey was, but he did know the man from Hopeton who sold fabrics, and he could be quite the fiend. He had a similar trouble to his run-in with Angus when he'd gone to buy a silk dress for Marilla. which was implied to be a special gift, but that didn't need to be mentioned. The Hopetown merchant had behaved roguishly, and Matthew suspected it wasn't the first time that the silk dress had been worn.
Oh, there are a lot more cherry trees, all in bloom. This island is the bloomiest place. I just love it already, and I'm so glad I'm going to live here. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to imagine I was living here, but I never really expected I would. It's delightful when your imagination comes true, isn't it?
Anne beamed as she bounced from one enraptured moment to the next.
Matthew Cuthbert was getting sick to his stomach. With each passing cherry tree, the idea loomed larger and larger in his mind. Matthew wasn't sure if this was his wildest dream coming true, or his darkest nightmare unfolding. The thought of bringing this waif of the world before his sister Marilla and addressing whatever mistake of communication had occurred was going to be excruciating for him and would be unimaginable to Anne. Oh, I don't know.
Truth was, if Matthew Cuthbert had lived alone, he would have never brought anything up by way of any supposed mistake of
sending for a boy.
Matthew Cuthbert was not the kind of man to shrink from Providence, and he knew when to let go of his own fool ideas. He'd lived his life tucked into the most beautiful acres of the most beautiful island in the known world, and he felt every bit of its blessing. Little was ever asked of Matthew, short of a nod on the road and perhaps a toonie in the church coffer. He couldn't imagine a more perfect fit for him or Green Gables than this little Anne Shirley. Matthew sighed, knowing no amount of imagination would change the reality that Anne would have to go back to the orphanage. Anne had kept up with her ocular exploratory pursuits, all the while Matthew had been ruminating. Matthew was the type who wasn't afraid to let a body talk, so long as he wasn't expected to keep up his end of the bargain. Matthew Cuthbert's best quality was his ability to listen, seconded by his ability to know when the hand of the Almighty was guiding his path. Both were in full effect.
Those red roads are so funny. When we got into the train at Charlottetown and the red roads began to flash past, I asked Mrs. Spencer what made them red, and she said she didn't know, and for pity's sake not to ask her any more questions. She said I must have asked her 1,000 already. I suppose I had too, but how are you going to find out about things if you don't ask questions? Oh, isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about?
Matthew remembered a time when he was prone to questioning, and he had found himself bare-ass whooped by the Avonlea schoolteacher at the tender age of 11 in front of his entire class. He hadn't asked a question in years.
It just makes me feel, I don't know, glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew everything about it, would it? There'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? Oh, but am I talking too much? People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? If you say so, I'll stop. I can stop when I make my mind up to it, although it's difficult.
Matthew smiled, genuinely enjoying the fractured expulsions coming from this damaged little creature. Matthew couldn't remember a time that he'd enjoyed the company of a little girl. Women had always confounded Matthew, and outside his interactions with his sister Marilla and Rachel Lynde, he'd decided that most of the fair sex, especially the younger generation, was always snickering at him.
You might call him a bit paranoid, but the truth was most women in Avonlea did giggle and furrow their brows at him, and had been for several decades now. He was the only man in their small social circle who never married, and he didn't seem the least bit dismayed by the idea. Rachel Lynde was quick to point out that neither Cuthbert seemed the least bit interested in being tamed and had gone from youth to old age in a blink of an eye. Well, I doubt there's a man or woman from here to Halifax who would take either of them now. I had held out hope for Marilla, homely as she is, to marry. I had thought perhaps John Blythe might take an interest after Miriam passed away last summer, but Matthew Cuthbert...
Rachel exposited to the group at the Ladies' Auxiliary to a chorus of laughs and titters. Matthew Cuthbert was like a wild cherry tree that had never been pruned, standing in a line of well-kept, fruit-yielding men of Prince Edward Island. He didn't lack for looks nor intellect as a young man. He simply loved working the land, bonding with his animals and pruning the grounds of Green Gables rather than himself.
Well, you can talk all you like. I don't mind,
Matthew replied slowly, breaking any tension between the two.
Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to get along together fine. Oh, it's such a relief to talk when one wants to and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me 1,000,000 times if I have even once. And people laugh at me because I use big words. But if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you? Well, now that seems reasonable. Mrs. Spencer said that my tongue must be hung in the middle. But it isn't. It's firmly fastened at one end. Mrs. Spencer said your place was named Green Gables. I asked her all about it, and she said there were trees all around it, and I was gladder than ever. I just love trees. And there weren't any of them all about the asylum, only a few poor teeny-weeny things out in front with little whitewashed cagey things about them. They just looked like orphans themselves, those trees did. It used to make me want to cry to look at them. I used to say to them, "Oh, you poor little things, if you were out in a great big woods with other trees all around you and little mosses and June bells growing over your roots and a brook not far away and birds singing in your branches, you could grow, couldn't you? But you just can't where you are. I know just exactly how you feel, little trees. I felt sorry to leave them behind this morning. You do get so attached to things like that, don't you? Is there a brook anywhere near Green Gables? I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that."
Matthew chuckled, knowing they had the best brook a child could ask for.
"Well, now, yes, there's one right below the house."
Anne's eyes burst open.
"It's always been one of my dreams to live near a brook. I expected I would, though. Dreams don't often come true, do they? Oh, wouldn't it be nice if they did? But just now I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't feel exactly perfectly happy because, well, what color would you call this?"
She twitched one of her long, glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. Matthew was not used to deciding on the tints of ladies' tresses, but in this case there couldn't be much doubt.
It's red, isn't it?"
he said. The girl let the braid drop back with a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes and to exhale forth all the sorrows of the ages.
"Yes, it's red,"
she said resignedly.
"Now you can see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody could who has red hair. I don't mind the other things so much, the freckles and the green eyes and the skinniness. I can imagine them away. I can imagine that I have a beautiful rose-leaf complexion and lovely starry violet eyes. But I cannot imagine that red hair away. I do my best. I think to myself, now my hair is a glorious black, black as the raven's wing. But all the time I know it's just plain red and it breaks my heart. It will be my lifelong sorrow. I read of a girl once in a novel who had a lifelong sorrow, but it wasn't red hair. Her hair was pure gold rippling back from her alabaster brow. What is an alabaster brow? I never could find out. Could you tell me?" "Well, my friend Angus said once that I had the most alabaster of brows, but I didn't approve of the tone in which he was speaking to me, so I didn't quite pay attention to its full meaning,"
said Matthew, who was getting a little dizzy. He felt as he had once felt in his rash youth when a young Angus Iverson had enticed him on the merry-go-round at a picnic.
"Well, whatever it was must have been something nice because she was divinely beautiful. Have you ever imagined what it must feel like to be divinely beautiful?" "Well, no, I haven't,"
confessed Matthew ingenuously.
"I have, often. Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful? Or dazzlingly clever? Or angelically good?" "Well, now, I don't know exactly." "Oh, neither do I. I can never decide. But it doesn't make much real difference, for it isn't likely I'll ever be either. It's certain I'll never be angelically good. Mrs. Spencer says, 'Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert!'"
That was not what Mrs. Spencer had said. Neither had the child tumbled out of the buggy, nor had Matthew done anything astonishing. They had simply rounded the curve in the road and found themselves in the avenue.
"Oh, this is what my sister Marilla always calls the avenue,"
replied Matthew warmly.
I find it enchanting,"
Angus Iverson said from the back of the buggy.
"Ah!" shouted Anne.
"Boo!"
Cuffed Matthew.
"The avenue has an even deeper red hue than I remember it,"
Angus tooted with his eye throbbing and bleeding down to his pantaloons. "Is there something wrong with your eye, mister?"
Anne inquired.
"Oh, no, my girl. It's totally fine."
Angus Iverson slouched over in his place and rolled to the back of the buggy.
"Thanks for the ride, Matthew."
Angus fell from the back of the buggy and was tossed neatly between two blooming apple trees. He smiled and nodded as the sorrel mare and buggy disappeared down the breathtaking stretch of road 400 or 500 yards long, completely arched over with huge, widespread apple trees planted years ago by an eccentric old farmer. Its beauty seemed to strike the child dumb. "Well, I guess you're feeling pretty tired and hungry,"
Matthew ventured to say at last, accounting for her long visitation of dumbness with the only reason he could think of.
"But we haven't very far to go now. Only another mile."